Okay, hello everyone. This video is going to be on materials, colors, and textures, changing and animating those, as well as lights and rendering within a Maya environment on anything, on an object. And so this is kind of assuming you've had very little Maya experience. It's pitched in this video toward the experimental animation students, and you can use this for class, but it could be used for basic modeling and basic understanding and theoretical aspects of adding color and animating colors and textures in Maya. Let's create 5 of these spheres to start and use for our color and texture samples. So just put one in the corner like this, one here. And I'm just hitting Command D for duplicate and put one in the middle, order kind of like that. Starting in, I'll assume that you have no pre-experience with using colors or textures or shaders in Maya. So far all you've been able to do is get this default gray color whenever you make something. In Maya, we're not going to think about it as just painting on something per se. We're going to think about what's called material and shader. So consider it this way. Say you want to paint your wall or something, and you go to the paint store, go to Home Depot, and you ask, you want this lavender colored paint for your wall. I don't know, just making up creative looking color. And you had the color exactly in your mind, and it was very peculiar. You know exactly, you find the tint, you find the swatch, and you say, I don't want this color, it's kind of lavender. Then the first question the person there asks you is what? What sheen do you want? They're going to say, well, you can have flat, you can have satin, semi-gloss, that kind of thing. And that has to do with something called specular in physics. Or in Maya, it's the same thing. It's how much the light is absorbed or is reflected back to your eye. Theoretically, that's the first thing you consider before you start coloring something in Maya. You actually claim a sheen or material that has certain shiny or dull properties. If I say, okay, let's start with this top left one, I want to color that red. Okay, the first step really should be to find a, quote, material that has physical properties of a shininess or dullness or satininess, then change that material into a color that's red. It seems a little bit backward, but it's going to make a lot more sense as we constructively, architecturally go through, build upon color palettes. It's all built based on this concept of shaders and networks and also materials, all that goes together, and think of it as claiming a system of physical attributes, not just color. Color is just one thing of many things that could give features to a surface. So in Maya and in all other 3D programs too, it's very similar, at least conceptually, that at once you not only consider color, but you consider the material, specular qualities, the diffuse qualities, we can talk about that, and other qualities that make up how that surface really looks. Another way to think about it is if you just look around right now, if you're at your desk or wherever you are sitting, and you just look around 360 what's around you right now, you're going to see things that have color, or to your eye you're going to perceive, your brain perceives it as color, and that vibration, depending how much available light. And you could say, well, that object's green if you have a glass next to you. Okay, you could say, well, that's transparent, but it has maybe a blue tinge to it. If you look at your own screen and maybe the edges, that looks black maybe, or maybe has very thin black edges. But actually what you're picking up, and a little bit not as consciously, is the sheen to the surface, whether it's shiny, whether it's dull. So we take that for granted all the time. Like if you look at a clock, an old school clock on the wall, we just assume that there's glass there. We can't see any color, or we can't see anything at all, but we might see a shiny part of what's reflected back to our eye. Or someone wearing a watch that is a shiny part. You know, we're looking at specular and judging what that material is simply based on whether it absorbs light, reflects light, or scatters light. So to go into this the right way, when we're talking about color, I think we have to go a little bit theoretically and really talk about the sense of material. What that material is made of and how it responds to light has a lot to do with what choices you make along with color. It all comes together in the same package. All right, so now that we know that, let's talk about color in the same breath we talk about material. Let's think about every time we have a different color, it is going to be housed by a different material. What do we get when we make anything in Maya? We get this default kind of flat looking gray. All right, now we're going to learn a really important tool called the Hypershade or Hyper Shader, and it is up here in Windows, then Rendering Editors, Hypershade. And recall, if you hold Shift and Command on the keyboard, you can put any menu item as an icon here, and it looks like that. And I'm going to click that, and that's going to open up the Hypershade window. Okay, so why did I open that up? So the Hypershade is really the brain, the center of how all the shaders and materials that we put together are going to be concocted. It's like the kitchen to mix and process all the colors, materials, and features that give an appearance. It's totally possible you could use Maya and color things and add materials without even opening up the Hypershade and knowing what's about it, but you really should learn the concept beginning, because it could really confuse you later if you don't. We're not going to worry about this part or this part quite yet. We're just going to concentrate in this area right here, which is the browser for any materials. Here's a tab for textures, utilities, rendering, lights, cameras. We're not going to use much of those. We're just going to focus right on, at the moment at least, on materials. And you see there's one that says Lambert 1 right there. That's a default material. And this particular material has no shiny part. Lambert's like flat. Again, like the Home Depot analogy, you want a certain color and they ask you, okay, what sheen? And you're going to say, I want flat or matte. So this is an old school kind of flat, no specular. Specular, recall, is the shiny part. So there's no specular on a Lambert material. All right, so by default, all 5 of these spheres have the Lambert, but aim to make the top left sphere red. So the first thing I should be asking is not just grab that paint, but try to get that red color and get the material at the same time. Remember that question, it's going to have red, but what sheen? So I'm going to give it a material first and then give it the color red. All right, so let's do that. A number of ways to do that, like anything in Maya, could be 10 different ways. I'm going to show you a quick way just through the gestural menu, and then you can forever use this because it's fast. Yes, you can create it through here and drag it. We'll do this even quicker. Right click right on this one, and this pops up, this gestural menu, and then we're going to drag down to assign new material. Remember, material before color. So then the material menu opens up, and then we have these blend, Lambert. We know Lambert, there's no shiny part, no specular. There's layered shader, there's Fong E, there's ramp shader, surface shader, use background. We won't get into much of those for sure. If you click down, you can see that there's a lot more materials. Some that give you like a satiny hair tube shader that looks like hair, anisotropic, and then Arnold shaders, which get yet more complex and have to interact with lights in the Arnold renderer. We're going to use just the really old school stuff for educational purpose real quick. Just want an old school Maya material and I want it shiny. Well, I could pick this Fong or Fong E because you could see it has a little shiny specular part, and I click it and you see how it's different than the rest. Okay, so that's step 1. And then step 2 is to give it the red color. Now we had the Hypershade open, and you look in the browser area and we have this little icon sample, and we see a new one called Fong 1. Now what we do to make it red is we click on it, if it's not already selected in the Hypershade, and we go here in this area, and it has common attributes for color. Click on it, and then you can drag to the red color, and it gives it that particular color. Okay, let's go on. You can mess with these, noodle with these if you like, but let's go on and just say, okay, good, mission accomplished there. Let's go to this one and make it blue. Okay, what are the steps? First, create a material. Right click, go assign new material. Drag down, assign new material. That opens, and we're going to click that one that says Maya right there because these are a little bit too extensive. So let's just give it a satiny feeling, like the specular on it is kind of like maybe a little bit like satin. So blend is one we can use. I'll back up again and do that so you see it. A right click, I'm going to back up a couple times here. Right click, and then I said assign new material, and then I've clicked this tab that said Maya, And then this one right here, Blinn, B-L-I-N-N. And this is all named after the folks who developed these many, many years ago. So Blinn has a satiny sheen to it, if you can see a little bit there. Not quite crisp as specular, and we click it, and then it gives, you can compare the shiny parts, not quite as crisp. Alright, now I said I want to make it blue. Next step is to go in the hyper shade and make sure you have that blend that you created selected, and then change the color to blue. Alright, let's do the corner one on the left. Let's give it yet a different material. Right click, assign new material. This time let's give it Fong E. Fong E is kind of like a satiny too, a little bit more stretched. The specular is a bit more attenuated. Alright, so we got that material, Fong E. You want to give that a color. Let's give that a green, sticking I guess with primary colors. And we do that. And we got green. Let's do this one, you guessed it, yellow, right? Right click, assign new material. We could make another one of these. We could grab something a little bit more creative. I would avoid the Arnold's for now, these Arnold materials, because they need maybe special treatment, kind of interesting ones. Maybe you could try, there's hair tube shader. Anyway, this one, by the way, is called hair tube shader, and it has this anisotropic type. There's a way you can customize the look of the specular to imitate physical properties, like the way light may shimmer or reflect off water, or something that's kind of like fabric or hair, of course. So that's an option. Well, I'll go back and I'll give it something more kind of typical. So let's do that one more time. I'm just going to assign new material, and let's just stick with the simple ones. I'll go and create another blend. So this blend 2, and I'm going to give this a yellow, as I mentioned. Then I've got the one in the middle. Right click and assign new material, and this time I'll do another Fong. Okay, and to give that color, I'll give it a violet color. Alright, so there you have it. That is how you put color on something constructed in usually 2 steps. This is more procedural, but it has a lot of power down the road. It seems clunky to do it this way, I know, but you only can realize how it does help efficiently when you begin a kind of assembly line thing, and you start with a lot of different shapes and colors. If this were part of a very complex background, you'd see the use of this. So I'd like to see if you can do that, and you could pause the video and do that first and make sure you can just add new materials and change the colors to them in the hypershade. Okay, now let's go to the other part, going back into the hypershade, seeing some of the usefulness of it. One is you have this kitchen of all the stuff you've already made, and these are materials with colors on them. These can be recycled or reused or detached or mixed and matched. This is what I mean. Let's say this one, red one, you really want it to be blue. You don't have to paint it or recolor it. You just go to the hypershade, middle mouse button, drag that material blue onto that one, and it takes on that connection, thus making it blue. You can make them all blue if you want. Really quick, rather than painting anything. Then all of these are connected to one shader. So there are connections going on behind the scenes here every time you drag and drop something onto an object. Let's try like making them all yellow. If I select that shader, we have what's going on downstairs, kind of interesting. It looks complex, we're ignoring it, but if I right click on that yellow one and say graph network, I see that I have a whole network of stuff going on and connecting into each other. So this is why it's really powerful, because you can always designate some shader to some things and then completely recreate the color of a scene by mix and matching these connected to each other. I can show you again how that blend right here is represented by this node with a bunch of different physical attributes, and it's connected in here called the shading group, or SG. We're not going to get into too much detail right now. Again, if you haven't tried this, just middle mouse button drag, and basically it's dragging and dropping That's how you recolor things, and what you're doing is attaching that color shader and dropping it onto the polygonal object, creating a new connection. As I mentioned before, there's many ways you could do this. You drag and drop it like I am to create that, or you could, through these menus, you can kind of do it the other way. Maybe just grab this blue one and say you want to make it red like this. You could do it this way. Go to the hypershade, right click, and say assign to selection. So yet another way to do it. If you have a lot of materials here and you're wondering what's attached to what, this one is convenient to learn. Let's say this green one, and let's say you have a lot of different green ones and you don't know which one it is. You can select the object here in the scene in Maya and then go under edit, and you could say select materials from objects. Okay, click that and you see that one lit up. It tells you that's the one that's attached to it. It's obvious now, but imagine if you had, you know, dozens and dozens of colors that were slightly different from each other and you didn't know which one. It works in reverse too. If you grab the red material here in Hypershade and then under edit you say select objects with materials, then in the scene it's going to tell you exactly which ones have that material. It gets really convenient and fast very quick, so maybe you can start to see the logic of how color works here. Okay, and I mentioned too, the one thing that really does confuse students is, say this red one, I want to change the color, okay, like to not dark red, let's change it to a really different color, like green yellow, maybe something with a little more of lime green and a little gray in it. So a color like this, kind of olive. One thing that will really confuse students sometimes, if they work in the Hypershade and they say, okay, I just want this color a little bit darker, and they just wanted that one darker, let's say. So you could go in the Hypershade and do it. Or, by the way, if you right-click, say, Material Attributes, right here in the Attribute Editor is very convenient. If you don't even want to use a Hypershade, it's up to you. But anyway, look what happens. This confuses so many people when they're first starting out. If they right-click and say, okay, that one, this olive color, I want to make darker. Okay, so they make that one darker, and they're like, crap, it made the other one darker too. Why is it doing that? I just want this one lighter, but it's also making this other one lighter too, or changing the color. Why is that? Well, you already know the answer why. Because they're sharing the same material. And this is why I showed you materials. I didn't jump right into colors, so you understand this concept. Physically, these are the same color to Maya, because it is sharing that Vong 1 right there material. So if you work through the Hypershade, you understand that there is an underlying connection there, and that if you want these two different colors, what do you need? You got it, two different materials. So the truth is, they're actually the same shader. So let's say if you had a problem like that, you would say, okay, well, I want to make this kind of a dark olive, you know, and I want to make this a light olive, but it keeps imitating it. Well, there's no other way out of this. You're going to have to create a new material for this one. So it has its own material and color. So you right click and say assign new material, and then you can give that a blend, and then in that blend you give it, you know, the color. You could save the color swatch here if you like, of course. And you say you want that a dark olive. All right, let's redistribute some of these colors again, just using the hypergraph to get the variety back. Okay. All right, there we go. We can look in visual attributes besides color, right, in the material viewer, the property editor here in the Hypershade. Again, right here, the attribute editor or channel box to your right is going to give some of the same data. This will look very familiar. It's one and the same. If you change one, the other one's going to change. So it's a preference thing. I wanted to get used to Hypershade early, so working in that's going to be helpful so you understand the mechanics, so to speak, of it. But if you want, this can be closed, and you could just work here in the attribute editor by just right-clicking, say, material attributes. You don't have to open up another menu. But now you understand how they're sharing materials. If you're confused and want to reascribe them, go back to the Hypershade. So I mentioned we could change other visual parts of it besides its color. We have here transparency, ambient color. You could change the color completely, of course, on a spectrum of millions of different possibilities, and its brightness once you have the hue. And then there's transparency. You could make it semi-transparent or halfway or almost all the way. It looks black, was totally opaque. There's ambient color. I don't really mess with. It gives it a milky kind of appearance. Incandescent means to give off light and glow, which I actually use rarely. Diffuse is something I use a lot. That's how much light it absorbs. Or scatters. It's the light that does not return directly to the eye. Right? So if we move down the diffuse, it gets darker. Now it's not quite the same thing as making color darker. It's just making physically the light being more absorbed in the surface. Alright, now specular, we've heard about that. That is the shiny part. If I turn off the specular, make the specular color from white to black, it removes the specular. It's going to look kind of like Lambert that has no specular at all. Here, by the way, of course, is the shader ball, which you can change to all kinds of different things, a teapot. This gives you a prediction of what it looks on a complex surface. Maybe if it's not like a sphere you want to look at, see what it looks like on actual hair. These are just test objects, of course. Talking about specular, and you can make it increase or decrease. And this material is called Fong and has some unique ways to change the size of the specular. Maybe if it's like a billiard ball, it can have a really tight, small specular. You can also give the specular a color if you want to give it a bluish tinge. Everything we're looking at is through the graphics card of your computer, or my computer, actually. This is not rendered. So in rendered, it's going to do a much more luxurious job of calculating all the light in the scene, anything bouncing off these objects, and we're going to be using Arnold as our renderer. So just know this is looking very plasticky and cheap. That's just the setup, and we're going to be getting into more lifelike rendering later. Now if I chose Lambert, there is no specular to mess with. It's not this object, right? So say if that one was that original Lambert one, I can change the color to blue or whatever I like, but there is no specular because some materials don't have specular at all. This yellow one is blend material, blend 2, and you can see it's slightly different in its properties that you can change about specular. Has the same things with transparency and ambient and diffuse, but it also has eccentricity. That's a little bit like a focus of the specular, even though it's a bit satiny. There's specular roll-off, which you could really exaggerate if you wanted to have a super shiny part. There's tricks you can do to get it to look like metal or other very reflective materials. And there's reflectivity here too. We can't see it until we render it, but it will start reflecting objects when you turn that up. Alright, so just to point out, there's other visual attributes you can change besides color right here very easily. Alright, next we're going to talk about texture. Putting colors on stuff just like this is probably pretty boring, but it's essentially you learn it, and then you're going to really build some beauty on top of it and some kind of remarkable looking surfaces with texture. So we'll talk about it in this next part. Okay, with texture, we have to have things ready with the material already prepared. You don't need to have color on here, but need to have some sort of material attached so we have a color node. And alright, let's just look at this yellow blend, which we did last time. So over here we see it has a blend material, as I mentioned. It has a colored node here which we gave yellow. So if there's no texture attached to it, it's just going to give the color you gave to the channel, whatever you chose. But it has, you see this line of black and white checker. That's an icon, and the icon stands for texture. So if in the color, the very top of the common attributes, if we click on the black and white checker, it's going to open up a menu to create a render node. What that really means is texture. So we have miscellaneous ones that just pop up. I'm just going to grab a checker right away so you can see it. So I didn't even click anything else. I just clicked only that icon of checker, and it opened up 2D, 3D textures, etc., etc. You can hop around in here, but you might get a little lost. Just stick to the default for now. Coincidentally, I'm going to select a checker texture. you see nothing. Why? You don't see anything after you click checker as a texture because you need to hit 6 on the keyboard. Just to review, 4 is the keyboard setting for wireframe. 5 is the setting on your keyboard for shade. So if we see all 5 of them again, 4 is wireframe, 5 is shade. So any textures that are present or attached don't show yet, but 6, any textures attached will show. So that's a real common question the student will have. Why are my textures not showing? Just right click and say material attributes. You have to be on top of the sphere. You can't do it here, right? Nothing will happen. You have to do right over the sphere, and you get back to where you were by click material attributes, not new material, just material attributes, and this opens up here. And then you see, remember that was yellow, but now it's taken. It's engaged in a new texture, and you don't see any more of that icon, but you see an arrow. It's kind of dark, but there's an arrow there, and if I click it, it takes me to another tab where it shows more detail. And yep, I could change the color of the checker if I wanted to. So checker color and create some garish kind of combination. If I ever lose my track, I can right click, just one gesture, right back to it with material attributes. There's another tab here that says place 2D texture. If you don't see this, when you can use these arrows to hop around and find it. There are another, you could find it through the hyper shader. There's a lot of different places. You can get kind of like a jungle. So fortunately I have the tab right there. It's place 2D texture. Well, why am I looking at it? I'm looking for it because maybe I want to make more checkers. And if I say repeat 4 and I put 40, do you see that? Just know there's tabs here to place a texture and control its location and placement on the surface that we're just going to kind of tickle, and we're learning right now just that these textures exist and how to show them. There's other stuff you can play with, see what they do too, and there's 2D texture. You can repeat UV, and that's what I used before. Repeat UV, and there's one that's revolve, let's see, rotate UV, coverage, all the stuff you can try. So let's try this one here. Right click, I'm going to go material attributes. Its attributes will pop up in the attribute editor, and here the most important channel right here is the color. Right now it's kind of a chartreuse. Click on this black and white checker and replace it with a texture. This time let's go cloth, and its color is completely replaced. So the way to think about this is if you painted a wall green and then you put wallpaper over it, of course in the end you're just going to see the wallpaper and no color green. Alright, anyway, I just grabbed a cloth texture and I'm putting some color on the cloth to get a different look out of this. Alright, cool. Then I have place 2D texture. I could repeat 4. I could put in 50. Really high, and it would look like more like cloth, right? Like interwoven cloth with a really higher repeat rate. So that's another example of a texture. Let's keep doing them, and I'd like you to try this alongside me to make sure you could add textures to all 5. So right click, I'm going to go again material attributes and go to color, go to the checkerboard icon. This one I'll grab a fractal. That's like a noise pattern. It looks like a lot of earth-like things like marble or terrain. We're talking about textures and we're making shaders, so every texture is going to be different, have different attributes and features to it, so you might dig around to find what they are. And there's a place 2D texture where once again if you want to repeat the pattern you can here. And I did the wrong one there, sorry, that was offset. That should be just set on 1. But here on repeat UV you could put in more complexity. You are looking through the graphics card once again. These are not quite rendered. They will look different under the eye of the renderer, but you can still pretty well see where they're headed. Let's just create a bunch of different ones. Right click, material attribute and color. Open up that. Let's place a grid on there. Then let's make the repeat higher, 40-40. Okay, like that. A wire pattern. But we could give the grid some color. Maybe it look like that Tron, like green on dark green kind of thing. Something like that, kind of be interesting. All right, let's create one more and right click, material attributes, color channel here, and let's do a, let's jump to down here and put a leather texture on there. Leather, and then change the color. I'm going to make it reddish. And then this one a little bit dark, like that. And you can change stuff here about its appearance. It's not displaying very clearly in the graphics card now before we render, but you can change some aspects here about it if you like, or just leave it. I'll just leave that. Leave it how it is, it's fine. Okay, now what was our goal in doing that? Primarily just to show you texture and how you put texture on pre-existing materials and colors. We're not really trying to control things yet, okay? Don't worry about getting exactly what kind of texture you want or control it. But what makes texture really powerful, just to make a big jump ahead, I put a checker and this thing that looks like a weave pattern and a grid, etc., leather. Those are really simple, mathematical, not very good looking CG kind of things. But what makes it sort of powerful is you can put a file texture on there. This is the way you would do all kind of realistic surfaces, and you'd mix it. You could put a real file texture that you like. For example, if you wanted the texture of anything you can find as a 2D pixel image on the internet, you could place that and make it a texture on it. For example, let's take this grid one right here. Let's go back to the material attributes of it. I want to get rid of that checkerboard texture. Just right click on color and say break connection. Okay, and this time I'm going to click again and put a new texture. Okay, but this time I'm going to put file. I clicked file right up here. And then I go search for a file, all right, and I click this little folder, and then I'm going to put an image file on there. So I'm going to put this picture I found of the elephant skin texture, it's just this one, and say I want to use it as a texture. It just makes anything in the universe you can come up with as a pixel image the texture for it. So I just select it as a file, say open. Now I have this elephant skin as a texture on it. So if it is a scalable texture, you can Google and look up scalable textures. You can repeat the number of UVs to get a more complex look. Okay, so I wanted to get more dense looking wrinkles in the textures that seem more complex looking. So I repeated it 10 by 10. Unfortunately, you could see a seam here. So if you wanted texture off the internet, you could look for seamless textures or make your own in Photoshop, which gets into something else, just FYI. But anyway, the point is you can use a file and put anything on there. This is going to lead into another subject really nicely, and that is bump and transparency maps. So we're going to learn those quickly. And we also are going to learn quickly how to put keys on anything. Anything can have animation keys, and that's the whole point of doing the experimental animation. If we're doing this for experimentation, we're able to change them over time. But anyway, let's talk about bump. Right now this is really, really smooth, and none of these textures are adding any bump or anything other than absolutely smooth plasticky look to it. So changing the texture back to just a UV repeated 1-1, and we can see how smooth it is. But let's say we wanted this wrinkly stuff to look bumpy. So what we do to do that is right click, material attributes again. You can do this in the hyper shade as well, or you can do it here in attribute editor. Now it's up to you, which is going to be more convenient. Anyway, I'll do the attribute editor. So I'm not going to touch the color node. That's fine. That already has this texture on it, elephant skin. I've got to leave that in place. Looking down the list here, I have something called bump mapping, and it has its own icon. I'm going to click that. I'm also going to say file texture, and I'm going to put the same file that I used for the color map, elephant skin, and I'll say okay. It's too much, but see how it's doing a bump. It's a bumpiness to it, right? It doesn't look much like elephant skin because right now it's set too high. But if we click the bump tab here, this popped up with it, bump 2D, and change the bump to be just slight, and be, you could go slightly positive or negative. You see that number, if I go 0.2, maybe even less, 0.1, and then pull away, you see how it's starting to feel tactile, like real skin. This once again is being played through, it's being seen through the graphics card. So if I would render that and Arnold would be getting more naturalism. Alright, let's try another bump here. What we did, just as a note, is we used a texture twice. We used a file texture, once for the color and then once for the bump. And for this one, for example, we don't need to use the same one. You know, we can do a bump here. So just right click, assign, ooh, my bad. Right click, material attributes, and then we observe that there's, of course, the color channel going on there with cloth, but let's say we wanted to have a bump on there. Material attributes, find its bump mapping channel, find that icon, click, and then we're going to put cloth on there. It's under 2D textures and then cloth, and now on the bump channel it put the bump of the cloth, multiplied it, the UV's 50 by 50, so let's do that here as well. And then you're zooming in, you'll see it does have a bump to it, probably pretty heavy, so right click material attributes, lessen its bump value here. You can see it. Sometimes just a little bit of bump will look good, like that. Maybe, you know, 0.1. It's very small here. You can see how it's bumping and looking like. Well, how does that work? How does bump work, by the way, if you're wondering? So, bumping in Maya, it bump maps, and there's also something called normal maps, which are more sophisticated. Anyway, they're in the category of bump maps, and how they work is anything that's light, it's going to bump outward, or dark, it's going to bump inward, or vice versa. It is value-based. So any image or any algorithm, anything that's built in Maya as a texture, or anything you find as a file, Maya is going to take any of the light parts or the dark parts and make them bump in or out, just based on that value. You know, it has nothing to do with the color. We could do another bump here, you know, material attributes, we get at here, there's color we're going to leave alone, and then we're going to go to bump mapping, and we can give it its own bump map. So in the grid, and we can see how it's bumping based on a very simple grid before we duplicated it, right? I think we multiplied that also 40, right? 40 by 40. And then it lines up, right? And then you see it almost looks like a cartoon line, but it is bumping. Once again, we can take down the bump depth. Maybe just a little bit is enough, just like 0.05 or something, and you can see how it's affecting. Alright, so that's bump. For this one, just to show you, we could do a bump that doesn't have to correlate to its color map. Every one of these others are correlating, the bumps correlating to the color map. But let's say you want to do material attributes again, leave the color alone, and put a bump map that's just different from its color map. Of course you can do that. And look for stuff that's strongly black and white, because I mentioned bump is based on value. So if I put a noise filter on there, you see, I should say a noise texture on there, you see how it's bumping. Bumping is just an illusion. It's not actually bumping. When you look at it close, it's the illusion that it's bumping. So it's playing with the light, but does give you a sense that something has relief to it and real texture to it. Here again, I can play with this and put in more combination of the color and the bump doing different things. Alright, well, that's bump, and hopefully you figured out how to navigate with material attributes. You navigate with these tabs, you can navigate in and out with these tabs, these arrows which you've connected. And what's going on is just behind the scenes to know in your hypershader you're creating a network. So if we look at any one of these right here and say right click graph network, look what's been cooking this whole time in the kitchen, so to speak, is we have a lot of these new nodes all put together. So we have Lambert, fractal here, we have a bump map, all plugged in. It looks kind of complicated, so we're not going to go too far into it, but just know connecting one node to another to give it a certain appearance. So we have a color node that's giving it one appearance, a noise, we have a place texture node that gives it how many repeats, and when we click around here and we go from tab to tab, that is the same thing as going node to node here. You see it change to the right? So these are all interconnected and really powerful. So we have a Lambert right there, which is the material. We have the shading group, which you don't have to mess with. That's just the appearance to render. We have the fractal, which in this case I think is that one, right? It's part of the color pattern. We have the bump that gives it that bump value. We have the noise that gives the bump its appearance and its text, its pattern. All these things are going and connecting each together to make a, a concoction of kind of like putting a meal together with all these ingredients, and all those ingredients put together is called a shader. And those shaders can be built articulately and attached to one object or not. And really, it's incredibly powerful, especially in experimental animation, because once you set these up, you could just experiment with connecting these in and out and animating those, and it just can go endless. Let's talk about one more type of texture, and that's a transparency map, because it's really useful. So you can see that the bump map's on there, and it's giving it a little punched out pattern, and here and the elephant texture there for a bump. But what about transparency map? Transparency is going to give some of it opacity and some of it transparency. If I wanted just choosing this one, this Fong E, right click and say material attributes, and it has no bump right now. Let's say we put a bump on there, we put a noise pattern. Yeah, it's all bumpy, and that kind of looks like chewed bubble gum or kind of weird. A neat color to it, a neat bump to it, but I just want something else. And I want to give it like pockets or maybe quadrants that you could see through. So what I could use there is a transparency map. So when I go to material attributes, I'll have this transparency channel. And you might remember if you go like this, you can make it see-through or opaque. So it's normally all the way to the left or black, opaque. But if you click this black and white checkered, of course, to put on the texture, it's under transparency channel. So now let's put a checkerboard on it, or be dramatic. So what happened there, it put any of the black checkers, it's going to make that transparent, and any of the white checkers, it's going to make opaque. But you can also reverse that quality too. So let's do that again. Right click, material attributes, we're going to go on the transparency channel, click the icon, go to checker, black and white checker. That's a really kind of neat look, and if you wanted to really make an interesting entity right away, you could just nest these spheres inside each other with a transparency channel, and then you get something kind of complex looking. And those could be rotating, etc. If you want to try it again, maybe on here and make this elephant texture part of it transparent, let's go to material attributes, go to transparency, click the node, and this time let's create a simplex noise. Now we have to be under transparency, make sure you got that right or it won't work. Alright, look what happens. Like some of it's see-through and cloudy, some of it's more opaque. Remember, hit 6 if you're not seeing anything. If it's looking like that, your textures disappear, hit 6. Okay, that would be a great thing for you to experiment with too. And let's end this part there, and then I'll talk about animating. Anything that you saw, we can add keys to, and we can animate those textures, colors, channels, etc. Alright, in this part, let's talk about putting animation keys and animating some of the colors and the textures. It won't take long, this part. Just pick any one of these 5, maybe this one. I duplicated some spheres inside that to make it more complicated. And I have this texture on it, and I have a bump map on it, and I have a transparency map. Pick any one of those you want to animate. How about the transparency map? So look at the transparency channel right here. We have some of the stuff. We could just right click and say set key. Remember that place 2D texture where we changed the repeat UV? Well, what if you set key? I'm looking at my timeline, and I just had frame 1. What if say set key on those two things? So what I did, right click, set key, frame 1. I'm going to go to frame, let's do 100 frame cycle test for everybody. And then around 50, halfway, I will put in repeat number. Let's go 40, just really high. And I don't know, 30 on that one, just mixing it up. Okay, about frame 60. I want to go halfway, but here we go. Set key, again, right click, set key, and then go back to the first frame. I'm going to make it loop. Go to the middle mouse button and click on 100, the last frame, and right click, set key. And let's see what we got. When I play it, I see the transparency map animating. I mentioned that I had a sphere inside a sphere. Might be interesting if I did a transparency dance on that as well. Now, because they're all sharing the same shader, it will have the same behavior. So if we look at the sphere inside it, you see a little bit is changing inside it. Pull it to the side, you can see it a little better. And once again, this is not rendered. Anyway, that's just a transparency you could put a key on. Of course, you could put a key on color, diffuse, ambient, all these other kinds of things. Let's go to another one and try mixing up stuff. How about this one? Maybe we just want the color to change, and so here it has a map on it, so we're going to maybe change the line and filler color. Let's go to frame 1. Let's right click, set key on line and filler, and let's go about halfway, 50 or 60, and then let's change that to a magenta for the line color, and for the filler color let's do kind of a cyan like that. It's a funky combo. And then set key, make sure I did that, then left mouse button click to frame 1, middle mouse button click on your last frame, mine's 100, and I will set key again so it's loopable and you can watch the color cycle and change here over time. Okay. What about right here, what about a bump map changing? Alright, if I go to the attributes in this bump channel here that I created, bump cloth 2, if I change to the black and white, I mentioned that bump maps and transparency maps are based on value. So darks and lights create relief patterns or recessed patterns, or transparency or opacity. So when I'm moving the darks and lights, you can see how it's going to affect the way things bump. So I could do an animation where I change how this weave pattern bumps in or out, or I could do an animation where I complicate the pattern of it. All kinds of kind of cool things. Or a wave or multiple things, or create a randomness in it. Wave spread. Just try all these different things, see what they do, and if I want, I could put keys on all of them, make sure I'm at frame 1, and just whatever you want to change. Almost every attribute in Maya, you can right click on the name, on the word, and say set key, and it creates a keyframe on that. Almost anything that's keyable, you'll find out quick, but just right clicking on it. Alright, and try changing stuff up. And this is where it's going to feel experimental, getting into the experimental aspects of going by feel and trying things to see if it looks good. Now, it's not putting a key on the timeline, they're buried a little bit, but they're there, they are there. And then I want to loop that again, left mouse button, middle mouse button to the end of wherever your loop is ending, and set key again like that. Anyway, so it'd get a pattern animating that's wavy and funky like that. We're just looking at the bump, not the color, as you might recall, so get that kind of interesting bump pattern swimming around. And yeah, we could change the color too in combination with it. Get material attributes. Let's go to the color. And if we wanted to put keys on this, we could start at frame 1, set key, set key, and right about the middle, we can change the color to kind of a dusty pink color, right click, set key. Here I want an orange, burnt orange kind of color, and set key, and then let's loop that as it was on the other features. So we have the bump moving and also the color changing over time. You can also animate the bump depth. Remember we saw that to make it look more stuck out or sunk in? Well, we can animate that as well, the bump depth. So here we have bump value and bump depth. So at frame 1 we can keep it as is, and then in the middle we can really bump it out so it's very strong. that, and then cycle it at the beginning with a copy frame. And we get a more pronounced result. All right, let's do one more and then work on a little bit of lighting, and then we'll be finished. All right, so which one should we do? Well, the elephant skin one, kind of interesting. So for the elephant skin, there's so many things you can experiment and try to animate. Again, anything you right-click on and say set key, you can change over time and put keys on. We haven't really touched specular color. This has a satin shininess to it, so let's change it from white straight off, and let's make this more of a blue, like an ocean blue. Okay, so we're going to put a right click and a set key, specular color. Once more, go to near the middle. Let's change the specular color here to pink. Right click and then copy that key. Left mouse button to click first, middle mouse button to click last, and right click to set key. Now we have a changing specular, and that can be quite interesting and effective when you're thinking about light characteristics, not just the color of the texture or the the diffuse, but the specular changing can add a lot of interest. Now I thought let's also put a little bit of movement on the transparency channel, because this does have a hazy transparency thing going. If it moved through it like in a smoky, mysterious way, it would be kind of interesting. So if I click on transparency and I have this simplex noise pattern, all these things can change its appearance. I can scale it. You see it kind of swirl like steam over it. That might be a good one to work with. So I'm going to go to frame 1, right click scale on noise, simplex noise again is what I used. Go around the middle once more, and then I'll change it to maybe 10, and then copy that frame. So I have that kind of mysterious action happening there. A wispy vapor creeping over it. It's kind of cool. Maybe a few more things. Let's see. Let's go to the attributes again. What else could we do? Let's go back to transparency, and what I recommend is just wiggle a few things around. Just give them a little wiggle to see if they do anything dramatic, and maybe if you like what it looks like in the spirit of experimentation, that could be a thing you animate. And just one thing at a time and undo. See, that looked kind of cool. Looks like a patchy calico kind of spotty thing. And what was that? Is frequency ratio. Let's try to do some keys with that. So I'll go to frame 1, frequency ratio, let's put where it was, near the middle, 0.5. Let's do more keys here than 3. I'll do a lower frequency ratio and then put it back up. Okay, and then one more where it's really sharp down like that. And then copy and paste the first to last key. Okay, see what that looks like. That's pretty cool. And again, once it has a transparency, you could put one sphere and duplicate it and put it inside the other sphere. Maybe just give it a rotation to give a very quickly sophisticated compilation. Animating textures inside of textures, colors inside of colors. Okay, I'm just going to move over to the subject of lighting, and I didn't animate all the colors and textures of these 5 spheres, but I'll focus maybe on a few of them, perhaps this swirly one here. It'd be kind of nice if I got the bump map to animate. Maybe I'll add that real quick. Just have a little bit of a shift in the, how about a rotate of the UV? Real easy to do. That's that original elephant skin. Let's just set key maybe in the middle, set another key, and then copy that quick from one to end. So we get a little bit of life. How about that? So that bump is showing too. It'd be something for the light to catch, so I'm really interested in a kind of a bump map animating to show the effects and features of the light phenomena here. All right, so we're going to move into it. So with light, which isn't going to be a full lecture, we'll just talk about a few lights that have been around a long time in Maya. We can start with a point light. Let's do that. So I'm going to hit the space bar and create for the hot box. You can always go up here and create lights and tear this off too, whichever you want. So hot box and you create lights. Then you have a small group of lights here, and tear off menu. If you are ambient light, a directional light, a point light, spotlight, area light, volume light. Well, I almost never use ambient light. Directional light is pretty common. Point light I use sometimes. Spotlight, yes. Area light. They all have different features. Area light is very smooth and sophisticated looking comparatively. Let's just start with a simple point light. And if I put a point light, click point light, nothing happens. But it created this little thing. You can't see it because it's inside the sphere, but it looks like an asterisk. It's just a little icon, but it is a light. And if I lift it up, it doesn't look like it's doing anything, but hit 7. Remember on your keyboard 5, going back, 4 is wireframe, and then 5 is remember, shade, 6 is textures, and then 7 is to turn on lights. Now look what happens when I move around this light. You can really see it. Let's turn off the grid. It's a little blocky, and maybe get a darker background. Can you see how, let's put up maybe its intensity a little bit, and you can see how it's affecting those spheres. This is the graphics card rendering only, but it's interesting because we have transparency on it. How it's penetrating some of those surfaces. It's a bit like ice or plastic that's been weathered or something. Just as a test, you can use a very simple point light to calculate light penetration very quickly. All right. So that's a point light, and its behavior is it's like a light bulb. The light rays go out in kind of all different directions. There's a spotlight which spots the lighting of an object, and maybe I won't go through and demonstrate the unique properties of every single light. That's probably something you can explore and do on your own. But here's a spotlight, and you can see how it spots and targets something like it's on a stage. And if you hit T, T is in Tom, it gives you the manipulator to point the spotlight at different objects. I'm not going to use that, I'm going to delete it, but as you can see there's different lights with different attributes, which are interesting. There is the directional light, which is parallel rays of light all within one direction. They're pretty functional, often used, that is, utilitarian, because you can really control the direction that they're heading. I should say the direction that the light rays are heading, and they're heading in a very parallel line direction. They're not splayed out in all directions like a point light is. And then with a volume light, it will give you kind of a soft box. Well, two things sort of give you a softer result. A volume light and an area light. They light an environment or a room with more soft edges to the light form. It's kind of like putting a soft shade or soft box. And what can be lit inside this sphere, or you can change the shape from the volume light to, start with a point light and experiment. And that's where the rest of this lecture is going to be headed, and toward rendering. Okay? So let's just focus on a simple point light to learn things. So we have that light we already created. It's shining on these objects as I move it. Well, here in its attributes, here's a point light. Of course, you're going to open the outliner if you make sure you don't have extra lights there. I don't want that directional light. I just want a point light there. Do check the outliner sometimes to know what is in there. So I know that point light's there. You can also see the lights displayed in the hypershade. Remember, I went through those tabs really early in this video. I went to materials, textures, utilities. There's all your textures, by the way. All the ones you made are stored there. It's a very powerhouse where this all contains everything. But there's a tab for lights, you know, so it's an organized way to catalog everything you have in the scene with lights as well. So hypershade I put up here. Anyway, I really won't need it. I'll just use that one point light here. Let me just, for a lighting demo, put something on the floor. You won't use this for your entity or whatever you're building right now in Final, but I want to use this to show you, here's a big kind of flat polygonal disc, to show you the effects of shadows and something. So I'm going to hover the spheres just off it like that and make this kind of big. All right, and maybe give that floor thing a new material, Lambert, and a little bit more interesting a color like that. Okay. All right, now let's talk a little bit about rendering. So far we're seeing everything through the graphics card, through whatever this immediate render is, viewport 2.0. When you render your entity or whatever you're working on, we are actually going to render it with these tools here, which takes more sophisticated phenomenology into account. That means like the light bouncing off things, shadows, obstructions, transparencies. We're going to use one called Arnold. There's an older one, there's a Maya renderer, and there used to be one called Mental Ray, which has been replaced by Arnold. When I said Arnold before, this is the name of the renderer we're using. So I will go to the Arnold tab, and this would appear in modeling here. If you don't see it up here on top, you might have to be in rendering. Rendering, it features, and also in the modeling menu set up here, it features. But I'll go to Open Arnold Render View. So again, it might be tricky to find that. So just starting in modeling, go in Arnold, open Arnold Render View, and it opens this window. There's nothing in there, it's black. So this render, it's an updated render. It means it can almost keep up time with real changes. Almost like a graphics card, but not quite. So if you click this arrow to start the render, it will do the render. Now it's dark, you don't see anything. We see a little bit of a highlight there. Now what is the reason? The reason is because this light to the Arnold renderer is still very weak. So you have to select it. And even though I put an intensity of 2.56, usually that's just around 1. You keep it around 1. This is in the point light attributes. But if you click the Arnold tab and then in exposure, let's put in from 0 to 8, you finally start to see something. Okay, so it's calculating what that looks like a little bit more. And then if I put an exposure up to 12, you can see it's interactively updating the brightness. But this, in contrast to this, on your right, in our Arnold Render View, that is a rendered result. And some shadows to fall under it, and it's looking really slick in comparison. But one thing you probably have noticed is that transparencies don't look the same. Actually, it does a much better job at representing that leather beaded texture, but the transparencies are really not there. It's really gone. So it's an extra step because of the Arnold render. It's a different render. I can show you how to do that perhaps, but if you don't have any transparencies in your entity, then you're not going to have to worry about that. But if you do, and you do want transparencies, you have a couple choices. The other choice is you could render it with a Maya renderer that sees the transparencies. That is a different renderer than Arnold. Okay, so now if you go up here with this little eyeball icon, click it, this render view opens, which is the more old school renderer for Maya. And here we have an Arnold renderer choice, and if we click here, it renders with Arnold same as here, but it's not going to be much difference. except this one is not interactive. The one with the eyeball is just one time, one click. Now if we change to Maya software and then clicked this button to re-render it, we will see the transparency. It doesn't look quite as good as the Arnold render, but it will do transparency. If you want to get the best of both worlds, you have to translate your transparencies into Arnold, which isn't that hard. But all right, so I just wanted to touch on that subject of lighting and rendering really quick, and let's do an overall look here. And I should add that you could animate lights and move lights. So having just one here, we can give that light some color. Maybe so, like, I don't know, I like it a greenish color, and then copy that, duplicate it, put another point light on the other side and give that a more warm color, and that hits 7. You can really see how it's going to light up and change the mood and atmosphere of the scene when you hit 7. Let's change that green to something more reddish, and this one maybe a more cool color, so we see variety. And let's move that kind of over again. If you really want to aim the light, you can hit T to try to point it. So T is for the manipulator tool right here. T is in Tom. If you can hit that and move it around, you can point any light and manipulate it. Alright, so if you wanted to animate the colors of the lights, it's just like any other texture or something. You could right click, start with that color, and the middle, change that to a yellow light or something, right click, copy and paste the first to the last frame as always. Okay, then you have an animated color light. It's hard to tell, but if you look right here, you can see the warm pool of light changing yellowish to cool. And of course you could have as many lights as you want and have them change color over time. Here we have this other light, and maybe you would want to have it start with this red magenta, then go to a orange sunlight sunset color, and then copy and paste it back to magenta. Then you have this kind of light show thing going on. Anyway, some examples. It can really change the feeling and the mood of the scene with that. If you so wanted to move the lights, like have a traveling light to create a raking effect of light over the surface of an animated texture, select the point light, let's say, and hit S, and then move it toward a different location. Hit S again and copy and paste that to the last key, and you'll see the light travel forward and back over the surface, which is pretty cool. Now, you can imagine when you get to your entity and all those surfaces are also deforming, it will really have a magnified and trippy result. Alright, I'm going to leave it about there. There needs to be a bit more discussion on how to create a final render, which I'll leave till another video.